The next morning, I sat in my car outside the school, hands shaking as I dialed the police. But before I could press call, Kieran grabbed my phone. "Wait," he said. "There's more you need to know." My heart stopped. How could there be more? Harrison didn't just hurt me, Kieran said. He made me recruit other kids. The words hit me like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" He called it identifying potential. One, I had to tell him which kids seemed lonely, which ones had problems at home, which ones would be easy targets. Kieran's voice was flat, mechanical. "I gave him names, Mom. I helped him hurt other kids. I felt sick. My perfect son, my moral compass, had been turned into a predator's accomplice. Tyler Rodriguez. He's been acting weird all semester. Harrison started mentoring him in September, right after I told him Tyler's parents were getting divorced." Kieran was crying again. "And Mia Chen, she's been cutting herself. I saw the marks and told Harrison she needed extra support." Each name was a knife twist. I knew these kids. I'd driven them to tournaments, bought them pizza after competitions. I'd watched Mia perform in the school play just 2 months ago, never knowing she was being systematically destroyed by someone I trusted. "How many?" I whispered. 7, he said. 7 kids I helped him target. Maybe more. Sometimes he'd ask about people and I wouldn't think anything of it until weeks later when I'd see them staying after school with him. I stumbled out of the car and vomited in the school parking lot. When I straightened up, Kieran was standing beside me, his face gray with shame. "I tried to warn Tyler once," he said. "I tried to tell him to stay away from Harrison, but Harrison found out. He showed me a video he'd taken of me and said if I interfered again, he'd send it to every college I'd applied to. He said he'd tell everyone I was unstable, that I'd made everything up because I couldn't handle the pressure of advanced academics." That's when I understood the full scope of the manipulation. Harrison hadn't just abused my son, he'd turned him into a weapon against other children. Every conversation Kieran had with his classmates had become potential intelligence for a predator. I called the police right there in the parking lot. Detective Morrison arrived within an hour. She was young, probably early 30s, with kind eyes that reminded me of my sister. She wore a simple gray suit and spoke with the careful precision of someone who'd heard too many horrible stories. "Mrs. Patterson," she said gently, "I know this is difficult, but I need Kieran to tell me everything, every detail, even if it seems insignificant." What followed was 4 hours of the most painful testimony I'd ever heard. Kieran detailed how Harrison had gradually isolated him from his friends, convinced him that their relationship was special, necessary for his future success. "It started with praise," Kieran said. "He'd tell me I was the most talented student he'd ever taught, that I had the potential to change the world if I was willing to work for it. He made me feel like I was chosen for something important." Detective Morrison took notes, her expression never changing, but I caught her hands clenching when Kieran described how Harrison had convinced him that recruiting vulnerable classmates was part of his leadership development. He said future leaders needed to understand human psychology, Kieran explained, that identifying kids who needed help was a skill that would serve me well in college and beyond. He called it emotional intelligence training. The detective asked about other adults who might have known. Had any teacher noticed changes in Kieran's behavior? Had the school counselor ever questioned the amount of time Harrison spent with students? "Mrs. Fletcher asked me once if everything was okay," Kieran said. "She noticed I'd lost weight and seemed tired, but when I told Harrison about it, he said she was jealous of our success and was trying to interfere with my college prep. He said jealous teachers often try to sabotage promising students." I remembered that conversation with Mrs. Fletcher. She'd called me during the second week of October, expressing concern about Kieran's apparent stress. He'd fallen asleep in her English class twice and seemed distracted during discussion. "I'm worried about Kieran," she'd said. "He seems overwhelmed. Maybe you could talk to him about managing his workload." I'd assured her that he was just working hard on his college applications and thanked her for caring. I'd even mentioned how grateful I was for Mr. Harrison's extra help with Kieran's essays and interview preparation. "Oh," she'd said, and there was something in her tone I should have paid attention to. "Mr. Harrison is helping with college prep?" "Yes, he's been wonderful. Kieran stays after school several times a week for guidance sessions." There had been a pause. "That's nice of him. I hope Kieran knows he can come to me too if he needs support." If only I'd listened more carefully. If only I'd asked why she seemed surprised that Harrison was providing college guidance. If only I'd wondered why my son's English teacher sounded concerned rather than pleased that he was getting extra help. Detective Morrison explained the next steps. There would be interviews with other students, a search of Harrison's classroom and home, forensic analysis of his computers and phone. It would take time to build a case, but they had enough evidence from Kieran's testimony to arrest Harrison immediately. "What about the other kids?" I asked. "The ones Kieran identified? We'll need to interview them too," she said. "Some may not even realize they've been targeted yet. Predators like Harrison are skilled at making their victims feel special, chosen. The kids might resist our questions at first." That afternoon, I made the hardest phone calls of my life. Each conversation followed the same devastating pattern. "Mrs. Rodriguez, this is Kieran's mom. I need to tell you something about Mr. Harrison, Tyler's debate coach." The silence on the other end stretched for what felt like hours. "What about him?" she finally asked. I could hear the defensiveness already creeping into her voice. Harrison had been Tyler's lifeline after his parents' divorce. He'd been the stable adult presence in a chaotic time. He's been inappropriate with students. Tyler may have been one of them. I heard her intake of breath, then muffled conversation as she spoke to someone else in the room, probably Tyler's father. "That's impossible," she said. "Tyler adores him. Mr. Harrison has been helping him through our divorce. He's been like a father figure." "I know this is hard to believe," I said, "but my son has given a statement to the police. Harrison has been arrested." Another long pause. Then, "We'll be right there." The Rodriguez family arrived at the police station an hour after we called. Tyler looked confused and frightened, still wearing his soccer uniform from practice. His parents looked like they were trying to hold their world together with sheer willpower. I watched through the glass window of the waiting room as Detective Morrison interviewed Tyler separately. His face changed from confusion to recognition to horror as she asked her question. His mother started crying before he even came out of the interview room. 6 months, Tyler's father said when they emerged, his voice hollow. 6 months of special tutoring sessions and college prep meetings. How did we not see it? Tyler sat slumped in a plastic chair staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes found mine through the glass. The accusation in his gaze was unmistakable. He knew Kieran had helped Harrison target him. Mrs. Rodriguez couldn't look at me. I understood. My son had helped Harrison target hers. How do you forgive something like that? Over the next week, 5 more families received similar phone calls. Each conversation was devastating. Each parent went through the same progression of disbelief, recognition, and rage that I had experienced. The hardest call was to Mia Chen's parents. Mia was only a sophomore, barely 15, with bright eyes and a quick smile that reminded me of Kieran at that age. When her mother answered the phone, she was cheerful, asking about Kieran's college application. Mrs. Chen, I said. I'm calling about Mr. Harrison. Oh, Mia adores him, she said. He's been such a help with her confidence issues. She's been staying after school for extra support sessions. She says he really understands what she's going through with teenage pressures. My heart broke. I think you need to talk to Mia about those sessions. Why? Has something happened? Mr. Harrison has been arrested for inappropriate contact with students. The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. No, she finally whispered. Not Mia. She's just a baby. But when they questioned Mia that evening, the truth came out. Harrison had been grooming her for 3 months, using her parents' work schedules and her struggles with self-harm as entry points. He'd convinced her that physical comfort was part of healing, that their sessions were therapeutic. The investigation moved quickly once it began. Harrison's computer contained thousands of images and videos spanning several years. Chat logs showed him grooming multiple students across different schools. There were detailed notes about each child's vulnerabilities, family situations, and psychological profiles. What chilled me most were the organizational skills he brought to his predation. He maintained spreadsheets tracking each victim's progress through different stages of grooming. He had backup plans for situations where victims might resist or try to tell someone. He'd even researched each family's background to understand what leverage he might have. Kieran's name appeared throughout the files, not just as a victim, but as Harrison's primary intelligence source. There were records of their conversations about other students, including Harrison's instructions on what information to gather and how to extract it without raising suspicion. Find out if Tyler's parents are really getting divorced. Read one message from August. And see if you can get Mia to talk about her eating habits. I think she's struggling with body image issues. Don't be obvious about it. Just listen and report back. Another entry from September. Kieran mentioned that Braxton Williams has been having trouble at home. His father lost his job last month. See what else you can learn about the family's financial situation. Vulnerable kids from struggling families make good targets. Each entry made me sicker. My son hadn't just been abused. He'd been systematically trained to help abuse others. Harrison had turned him into a recruiting tool, using his natural empathy and social connections as weapons against his own classmates. The preliminary hearing was held 3 weeks later. Harrison sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, looking nothing like the charismatic teacher who'd won countless awards. His hair was unkempt, his face hollow, but his eyes still held that calculating intelligence that had made him so effective at manipulation. His lawyer argued that the charges were based on malicious lies from troubled teenagers seeking attention. She painted Harrison as a dedicated educator who'd been unfairly targeted by students who couldn't handle his high academic standards. Mr. Harrison dedicated his life to helping at-risk youth, the defense attorney claimed. These accusations are a coordinated attack by students who felt challenged by his expectations for excellence. My client's only crime was caring too much about these children's futures. I watched the parents in the gallery flinch at those words. Caring too much. As if demanding sexual favors from teenagers was somehow educational. As if systematic psychological manipulation was a form of mentorship. The prosecutor presented a different picture. She detailed Harrison's pattern of behavior across multiple schools, his methodical approach to identifying and grooming victims, his sophisticated understanding of child psychology that he'd weaponized for abuse. This was not an educator who crossed boundaries in the heat of passion, she said. This was a calculating predator who turned teaching into hunting. He used his position of trust to systematically abuse children, and when his victims tried to resist, he manipulated them into becoming accomplices in the abuse of their peers. Kieran testified first. He was calm, methodical, heartbreaking. He wore a navy suit I'd bought for college interviews that would never happen, at least not in the way we'd planned. His voice was steady as he detailed how Harrison had gradually normalized inappropriate contact, convinced him that their relationship was special and necessary for his success. He said that intimate relationships with mentors were common in elite academic circles, Kieran said, that it was part of the price of excellence. He showed me articles about historical figures who'd had similar relationships with their teachers and achieved great things because of them. The defense attorney tried to rattle him during cross-examination. She was a small woman with sharp features and an aggressive style that felt like watching someone attack a wounded animal. Isn't it true that you actively participated in targeting other students? Yes, Kieran said quietly. You helped Mr. Harrison identify vulnerable classmates? Yes. You provided him with personal information about these students, knowing he would use it to manipulate them. I thought I was helping them, Kieran said. He told me that identifying students who needed support was part of developing my leadership skills. But after months of your own relationship with Mr. Harrison, didn't you understand exactly what he intended to do with that information? Kieran's composure finally cracked. I was 17 years old. I was scared and confused and thought I had no choice. He convinced me that helping him was helping my classmates. He said he was going to provide them with the same special guidance he was giving me. The prosecutor objected before the defense could continue that line of questioning, but the damage was done. I could see jurors looking at Kieran with suspicion rather than sympathy. In their eyes, he'd transformed from victim to accomplice. Tyler testified next. His account was similar to Kieran's. Gradual grooming, inappropriate contact disguised as mentoring, threats about college recommendations if he told anyone. But there was an anger in Tyler's testimony that hadn't been present in Kieran's. When asked about how Harrison had initially approached him, Tyler's eyes found Kieran in the gallery. He said my friend Kieran had mentioned I was going through a tough time with my parents' divorce. Tyler said that Kieran was worried about me and thought I could benefit from some extra support. The words hung in the courtroom like an accusation. Tyler's parents shifted in their seats, their eyes also turning to Kieran. I watched my son shrink into himself, the weight of his unwitting betrayal pressing down on his shoulders. The prosecutor tried to redirect. Did Mr. Harrison ever explain why Kieran had shared information about your family situation? He said it showed how much Kieran cared about me. That good friends look out for each other by identifying when someone needs help. Tyler's voice was bitter. He made it sound like Kieran was being a good friend. Mia's testimony was the most difficult to hear. At 15, she was the youngest victim, and her small voice barely carried across the courtroom. Harrison had targeted her during a particularly vulnerable time, when her parents' long work hours left her alone most afternoons, and she was struggling with depression and self-harm. He said he was worried about me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That my friend Kieran had noticed I seemed sad and asked him to check on me. He said physical comfort was part of healing, that it was what I needed to feel better about myself. Her parents held each other and cried throughout her testimony. Her father, a usually composed businessman, was shaking with rage. When Mia described how Harrison had convinced her that their therapy sessions were helping her overcome her cutting behavior, her mother had to leave the courtroom. The prosecution presented evidence of Harrison's previous allegations at other schools. In each case, he'd been quietly transferred rather than investigated. School districts had covered up complaints to avoid scandal, leaving him free to target new victims at each subsequent posting. This pattern of abuse spans over a decade, the prosecutor argued. Mr. Harrison has left a trail of damaged children across 3 school districts. The defendants were failed not just by their abuser, but by the systems designed to protect them. Each time a complaint was made, it was buried to protect the institution's reputation, allowing this predator to continue hunting. The evidence was overwhelming. Harrison's defense crumbled under the weight of forensic evidence, victim testimony, and documentation of his systematic approach to abuse. His lawyer switched strategies, arguing for a plea deal in exchange for cooperation with identifying other victims at previous schools. The plea hearing was surreal. Harrison stood before the judge and admitted to 23 counts of sexual abuse of minors, 5 counts of child endangerment, and 12 counts of possession of child pornography. His voice was flat, emotionless, as he recited his crimes like a grocery list. Do you understand that you are giving up your right to trial? The judge asked. Yes, Your Honor. And do you understand that by pleading guilty, you are admitting that you committed these crimes against children who trusted you? Yes, Your Honor. I wanted him to look at us, the families he'd destroyed. I wanted him to acknowledge what he'd done, to show some hint of remorse or recognition of the pain he'd caused. But he kept his eyes down throughout the entire proceeding, refusing to make eye contact with any of his victims or their family. The sentencing hearing was held 2 months later. Each family was given the opportunity to make victim impact statements. The courtroom was packed, not just with our families, but with victims from Harrison's previous schools who'd driven hours to see justice finally served. Tyler's father spoke first. He was a tall man, an engineer who usually spoke with the precision of someone comfortable with facts and data. But his voice shook as he addressed Harrison directly. You didn't just abuse my son, he said. You destroyed his ability to trust. He was a confident, outgoing kid before you got your hands on him. Now he barely speaks to anyone outside our immediate family. He's in therapy 3 times a week, and we still don't know if he'll ever be the same. He paused, looking directly at Harrison. But you know what makes me angriest? You made him doubt his own friends. You used his friendship with Kieran to get to him, and now he can't trust his own instincts about people. You didn't just steal his innocence. You stole his ability to believe in the goodness of others. Mia's mother was too emotional to speak. Her father read a statement on behalf of both parents, his voice cracking with every sentence. Our daughter attempted suicide 6 months after your mentoring began, he said. We almost lost her because of what you did. She spent 2 weeks in a psychiatric hospital, and we spent those 2 weeks wondering how we'd failed to protect our child. He looked up from his prepared statement. She's 15 years old. She should be worrying about homework and friends and whether boys like her. Instead, she's learning to live with trauma that will follow her for the rest of her life. Other parents spoke about the ripple effects. Siblings who developed anxiety watching their brothers and sisters suffer, families torn apart by guilt and blame, children who'd lost their sense of safety in the world. When it was my turn to speak, I looked directly at Harrison for the first time since his arrest. He was still staring at the table, but I could see his jaw working, the only sign that he was listening. You didn't just abuse my son, I said. You turned him into a weapon against other children. You made him complicit in their abuse. That guilt will haunt him for the rest of his life. I took a breath, fighting to keep my voice steady. Kieran was 17 years old. He trusted you. He looked up to you. And you used that trust to make him an accomplice in the destruction of his friends. That's not just abuse. That's psychological torture. Finally, Kieran spoke for himself. He'd agonized over what to say, writing and rewriting his statement dozens of times. In the end, he spoke without notes, his words coming from a place of pain I could barely comprehend. I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself for helping you hurt my friends. he said. But I know I'll spend the rest of my life trying to prevent other kids from going through what we went through. He looked at Harrison, who still wouldn't meet his eyes. You made me believe I was special, that our relationship was about my potential, my future. But you were just using me. You turned my care for my friends into a tool for their destruction. His voice grew stronger. I want other kids to know that if an adult makes you feel responsible for keeping secrets, if they make you feel like you're special in a way that has to be hidden, if they ask you to provide information about your friends, that's not mentorship. That's predation. Harrison was sentenced to 35 years in prison. He'll be eligible for parole in 2047 when he's 73 years old. As the judge read the sentence, I finally saw emotion on Harrison's face. Not remorse, but anger. He was furious at being caught, at having his carefully constructed life destroyed. The civil lawsuits against the school district took 2 more years to resolve. The legal process was almost as traumatic as the original abuse. Depositions forced the victims to relive their trauma over and over, while the district's lawyers tried to minimize the harm and shift blame to the families for not recognizing the signs. The district eventually paid out $12 million to the victims and their families. New policies were implemented requiring background checks for all staff, mandatory reporting training, and oversight of any one-on-one interactions between teachers and students. But the real change came from the spotlight the case shone on institutional cover-ups. 3 superintendents from Harrison's previous districts were forced to resign when investigators revealed they'd been aware of complaints against him. The state passed new laws requiring automatic reporting of any allegations against educators, making it impossible for districts to quietly transfer problematic teachers. But no amount of money or policy changes could undo the damage to 8 young lives. Kieran started therapy immediately after Harrison's arrest. Dr. Williams, his therapist, specialized in trauma recovery for abuse victims. She was a middle-aged woman with gray hair and gentle eyes who'd worked with survivors for over 20 years. The sessions were brutal. Hour after hour of Kieran reliving the abuse, working through his guilt about helping Harrison target other students. Trauma bonding is a real phenomenon, Dr. Williams explained to me during a family session. When someone is both the source of fear and comfort, the victim develops a complex attachment that can take years to unravel. Kieran wasn't complicit in his own abuse or anyone else's. He was a victim who was manipulated into helping his abuser. But intellectual understanding and emotional acceptance are 2 different things. Kieran struggled with the distinction between being victimized and being responsible. He wrote letters to every victim, apologizing for his role in their targeting. Some families accepted his apology, others didn't. Tyler's parents forbade any contact. Our son trusted yours, his mother told me at the grocery store 6 months after the trial. That trust was used to destroy him. We can't have Kieran in Tyler's life anymore. It's too painful for everyone. I understood their anger, but it broke my heart. Kieran was as much a victim as their son, but he'd forever carry the additional burden of feeling responsible for others' pain. The isolation was almost as damaging as the original abuse. The hardest part was watching Kieran blame himself for things beyond his control. He'd wake up from nightmares, not about his own abuse, but about the moment he told Harrison that Mia was cutting herself. He'd replay conversations with Tyler about his parents' divorce, wondering if there was something he could have said differently. I gave him the key to hurting her, he'd say during therapy sessions. If I hadn't told him about the cutting, maybe he would have left her alone. Kieran, Dr. Williams would respond patiently. Harrison was going to abuse someone. If it wasn't Mia, it would have been another vulnerable student. Predators don't stop hunting because they can't find one particular victim. You're not responsible for his choices. The logic made sense, but guilt isn't logical. Kieran carried the weight of every victim's pain on his shoulders, convinced that his information had made their abuse possible. His senior year was a nightmare. Half the school saw him as a hero for speaking out against Harrison. The other half saw him as a collaborator who'd helped a predator target his classmates. He ate lunch alone, studied alone, walked the halls with his head down. Teachers didn't know how to treat him. Some were overly sympathetic, treating him like he might break at any moment. Others seemed suspicious, as if his association with Harrison made him somehow contaminated. The debate program was suspended indefinitely, and Kieran lost his main academic passion along with his faith in adults. College applications sat untouched on his desk for months. How do you write an essay about overcoming adversity when you're not sure if you're a victim or a perpetrator? How do you explain a gap in extracurricular activities when that gap exists because your mentor was arrested for abusing you and your classmates? His guidance counselor, Mrs. Fletcher, tried to help. She was the same teacher who'd noticed Kieran's weight loss and tried to check on him earlier in the year. The guilt she carried for not pushing harder was written all over her face every time she looked at him. You have options, she told him during one of their meetings. Your grades are still excellent. Your SAT scores are strong. The abuse doesn't define your academic potential. But Kieran couldn't see past his guilt. How can I go to college and pretend to be normal when I helped hurt people? Finally, in January, I sat him down for the hardest conversation of my life. Kieran, I said, you have 2 choices. You can let what Harrison did to you and made you do define the rest of your life, or you can decide to move forward. How can I move forward? He asked. How can I go to college and pretend to be normal when I helped hurt people? By using what you learned to help others, I said. By making sure no other kid goes through what you went through. By becoming the adult you needed when you were 17. That conversation changed something in Kieran. He finished his college applications, writing honestly about his experience with Harrison and his desire to work in victim advocacy. Several schools rejected him outright. The scandal had made national news, and some admissions officers couldn't see past the headlines to the traumatized teenager beneath. But others saw his story differently. A small liberal arts college in Vermont offered him a full scholarship to study social work with a focus on trauma recovery. The admissions officer who called him was a survivor herself, someone who understood that victims could become powerful advocates. "We believe in second chances," she told him during his interview. "More importantly, we believe in the power of lived experience to drive meaningful change. Your story isn't a liability, it's your greatest strength." Kieran thrived in college in ways I hadn't expected. He found professors who understood trauma, classmates who didn't judge him for his past, and a sense of purpose that had been missing since the abuse began. For the first time in years, he had hope for his future. He graduated summa cum laude 4 years later and immediately enrolled in a master's program specializing in institutional abuse and coercion. His thesis examined how predators in positions of authority manipulate victims into becoming accomplices, using his own experience as a case study. "Understanding the psychology of coercion is crucial for prevention," he wrote. "Victims who are forced to participate in the abuse of others often carry additional trauma that goes unrecognized by traditional treatment models. They need specialized support that addresses not just their victimization, but their complex feelings of guilt and complicity." His research was groundbreaking. He identified patterns in how predators recruit victim accomplices, developed screening tools for recognizing coercion, and created treatment protocols specifically for survivors who'd been forced to participate in others' abuse. Now, at 26, Kieran works for a nonprofit that advocates for abuse survivors. He specializes in cases involving institutional cover-ups and coercion. His clients include former students from Harrison's previous schools, children abused by coaches and religious leaders, and other survivors who were manipulated into helping their abusers. "I can't undo what I helped him do," Kieran told me recently, "but maybe I can use that experience to help other survivors understand they're not to blame for what they were forced to participate in." His work has taken him across the country, testifying in cases where institutions tried to cover up abuse, training law enforcement on recognizing coercion, and speaking at conferences about the complex dynamics of institutional predation. Some of the other victims have found similar paths to healing. Tyler became a social worker specializing in adolescent trauma. Despite his parents' initial anger toward Kieran, Tyler reached out when he turned 18, recognizing that they'd both been victims of the same predator. "I blamed you for a long time," he told Kieran during their first meeting in 3 years. "But my therapist helped me understand that Harrison would have found a way to get to me regardless. He was the adult. He was the one with power. We were just kids trying to survive." Mia started a nonprofit providing mental health resources for teenagers. She focuses particularly on self-harm prevention, using her own experience to help other young people recognize when adults are using their vulnerabilities against them. "Harrison convinced me that cutting myself was why I needed his help," she explained during a presentation at a youth conference. "He made my mental health struggles the justification for his abuse. I want other kids to know that needing help doesn't make you a target. It makes you human." The other victims have found their own ways to transform their trauma into purpose. They've all remained connected through a survivor support group that meets monthly, creating the kind of community they needed when they were teenagers. But the scars remain. Trust doesn't come easily for any of them. Kieran still has nightmares, though they're less frequent now. He's been in therapy for 9 years and will probably continue for the rest of his life. Romantic relationships remain difficult. The idea of physical intimacy terrifies him, tangled up as it is with memories of Harrison's abuse. He's had a few relationships over the years, but they've all ended when his trauma responses became too overwhelming. "It's not fair to ask someone to navigate my triggers," he told me once. "I can't tell the difference between healthy affection and manipulation sometimes. Until I figure that out, I'm better off alone." Dr. Williams says this may change with time, but there are no guarantees. Trauma affects everyone differently, and Kieran's particular experience, being both victim and unwitting accomplice, created complex layers of guilt and shame that resist traditional treatment approaches. The ripple effects extended far beyond the immediate victims. Several teachers left the profession after the scandal, questioning their ability to protect students. Parents became hypervigilant about their children's relationships with adults, sometimes to the detriment of healthy mentoring relationships. The debate program was discontinued for 3 years before being revived with strict protocols about adult-student interactions. Trust between parents and the school administration was shattered and took years to rebuild. I struggled with my own guilt for years. How had I missed the signs? How had I been so grateful for Harrison's attention that I'd essentially handed my son over to a predator? The warning signs had been there. Kieran's weight loss, his nightmares, his withdrawal from friends, the way he'd become secretive about his time with Harrison, defensive when I asked questions about their sessions, the gradual change in his personality from outgoing and confident to anxious and isolated. "You couldn't have known," friends would tell me. But that wasn't entirely true. There had been signs I'd ignored or explained away, because I trusted Harrison implicitly. The hardest part was realizing how my own biases had blinded me. Harrison was white, well-educated, respected in the community. He'd won Teacher of the Year 3 times. He coached the debate team to state championships. Every social cue told me he was safe, trustworthy, someone to be grateful for. If he'd been a janitor or a bus driver, someone without the armor of professional success and social status, would I have been more suspicious? Would I have asked harder questions about why he was spending so much time with my son? Probably. And that realization forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about who we trust and why. We're conditioned to respect authority, to be grateful when successful people take interest in our children. That conditioning makes us vulnerable to predators who understand how to exploit our assumptions. I became an advocate too, in my own way. I speak at parent groups about recognizing grooming behaviors, about the myths that prevent us from seeing predators hiding in plain sight. The most important message I share is this. Predators don't look like strangers lurking in dark alleys. They look like the teachers, coaches, and mentors we trust most. My presentations focus on the subtle signs of grooming that parents often miss. The way predators gradually isolate children from their peers while making it seem like special attention. How they create artificial emergencies or opportunities that require private time with victims. The way they use children's natural desire for adult approval against them. Harrison didn't start by abusing my son, I tell audiences. He started by making him feel special, chosen, destined for greatness. The abuse came later, once Kieran was emotionally dependent on that validation. I share the questions I wish I'd asked. Why did Harrison need so much private time with Kieran? Why were their sessions always behind locked doors? Why did Kieran become defensive when I tried to learn details about their college prep work? Trust your instincts, I tell parents. If something feels off about an adult's relationship with your child, investigate. Don't worry about seeming ungrateful or overprotective. Your child's safety is more important than anyone's feelings. The hardest part of these presentations is discussing the secondary victims, the children who were targeted because of information other victims provided. Many parents struggle to understand how their own child could become an unwitting accomplice. Predators are experts at manipulation, I explain. They don't just abuse children, they transform them into tools for finding new victims. Your child isn't responsible for what an adult forced them to do, but understanding how predators use children against each other helps us protect everyone. These conversations led to policy changes in our school district and others. New protocols require multiple adults present during any private mentoring sessions. Background checks now include references from previous positions, with specific questions about why teachers left their prior schools. There are mandatory training sessions for all staff about recognizing and reporting suspicious behavior. But the most significant change has been cultural. Parents are more vigilant now, more willing to ask uncomfortable questions about adult-child relationships. Teachers are more aware of how their interactions with students might be perceived and more likely to report concerns about colleagues. Harrison is eligible for parole in 2047. By then, Kieran will be 46 years old. The other victims will be in their 40s too. They'll have built lives, careers, maybe families of their own, but they'll still carry the weight of what that trusted teacher did to them in high school. Recently, Kieran told me about a case he's working on. A young man whose wrestling coach forced him to recruit teammates for abuse. The parallels to his own experience are obvious and painful, but also therapeutic in a way. He keeps saying he's as bad as the coach, Kieran told me, that he chose to hurt his teammates, that he could have said no. What do you tell him? The same thing Dr. Williams told me for years before I finally believed it. That children can't consent to abuse, and they can't be held responsible for being manipulated into participating in someone else's crimes. Do you believe that about yourself now? Kieran was quiet for a long moment. Most days, he said finally. Some days I still wonder if I could have done something different, if I could have protected Tyler and Mia and the others. But I'm learning to live with the uncertainty. That's the thing about trauma. It doesn't follow a neat timeline toward healing. There are good days and bad days, progress and setbacks, moments of clarity and periods of doubt. Healing isn't a destination you reach, it's a process you commit to every day. But there's also growth. Kieran isn't the same broken teenager who sat on that bathroom floor 9 years ago. He's found purpose in his pain, meaning in his suffering. He's used his experience to help dozens of other survivors understand they're not alone. Last month, he received a letter from a girl in Oregon whose gymnastics coach had forced her to recruit teammates for abuse. She'd read about Kieran's work online and reached out for help understanding her own feelings of guilt and complicity. I thought I was the only person who'd ever been made to help their abuser, she wrote. Reading about your experience helped me realize I wasn't responsible for what he made me do. I'm starting therapy next week, and I wanted to thank you for showing me that healing is possible. These letters come regularly now, from survivors across the country who found hope in Kieran's story. Each one reminds him that his suffering wasn't meaningless, that his experience can serve as a lighthouse for others navigating similar darkness. The system failed all of these kids. Harrison was allowed to abuse students for over a decade because schools prioritized reputation over protection. But those kids, now adults, have refused to let that failure define them. They've become the advocates, the protectors, the voices for other children who can't speak for themselves yet. They've transformed their trauma into a force for change, ensuring that future generations have better protection than they did. Tyler now runs training seminars for school administrators about recognizing institutional cover-ups. He's testified before state legislatures about the need for mandatory reporting laws and transparent investigation processes. I can't change what happened to me, he tells lawmakers, but I can make sure the systems that failed to protect me are reformed so they don't fail other kids. Mia's work with teenagers has prevented countless suicides and instances of self-harm. Her nonprofit has developed screening tools that help identify when young people's mental health struggles are being exploited by predatory adults. Predators target kids who are already struggling, she explains in her presentations. They use our pain as a weapon against us. But pain can also be transformed into purpose if we have the right support. The other survivors have found their own ways to channel their experiences into positive change. One became a prosecutor specializing in crimes against children. Another developed educational programs about healthy relationships and consent. They've all refused to let Harrison's abuse be the end of their stories. Even the families have found ways to heal and help others. Tyler's parents now facilitate support groups for families of abuse survivors. Mia's parents started a foundation that funds therapy for victims who can't afford treatment. We can't undo what happened to our children, Tyler's father told me recently. But we can make sure other families have resources we didn't know existed when we needed them. The community that formed around this tragedy has become a powerful force for change. What started as a group of devastated families has evolved into a network of advocates working to prevent institutional abuse and support survivors. There's something profound about watching people transform their worst experiences into their greatest contributions. It doesn't erase the trauma or make the abuse acceptable, but it proves that even the darkest experiences can become sources of light for others. Kieran often says that Harrison stole his innocence but couldn't steal his purpose. The boy who was manipulated into helping abuse his friends became the man who dedicates his life to protecting other children from similar manipulation. "I'll never get back the person I was before Harrison," he told me once. But maybe the person I became because of what he did can help other kids keep their innocence longer. Some wounds never fully heal. We just learn to live with the scars and use them to recognize when others need our help. That's the most heartbreaking and hopeful thing I've learned from my son's confession. That even in our darkest moments, we can choose to become the light that guides others out of their darkness. The abuse is still with us every day. Kieran still checks locks twice before bed. He still has panic attacks in crowded spaces. He still struggles with trusting his own judgment about people's intentions. These responses may never fully disappear, but he's also accomplished things I never imagined possible. He's testified before Congress about institutional abuse. His research has influenced policy in 12 states. He's helped law enforcement develop better interview techniques for victims who were forced to participate in others' abuse. Most importantly, he's helped other survivors understand that they're not responsible for what adults forced them to do. He's shown them that it's possible to carry guilt and still build a meaningful life, to live with trauma and still find purpose. Harrison may have destroyed the life Kieran thought he'd have. The carefree college experience, the easy trust in authority figures, the simple belief that the world is fundamentally safe. But from the ashes of that destruction, Kieran built something else. A life dedicated to protecting others from similar destruction. The boy who once recruited victims for a predator became the man who helps other victims understand they're not to blame for what they were forced to do. The teenager who carried crushing guilt became the adult who helps other survivors learn that healing is possible even when forgiveness of themselves seems impossible. This is what I've learned from my son's confession. Sometimes the most heartbreaking thing a child can tell you becomes the foundation for the most meaningful work they'll ever do. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to them becomes the reason they're able to help prevent it from happening to others. It doesn't make the abuse acceptable. It doesn't erase the trauma or magically heal the wounds. But it proves that even the darkest experiences can be transformed into light, that even the most devastating betrayals can become the foundation for the most important work. When Kieran was 17, sitting on that bathroom floor, he thought his life was over. He thought he'd never be able to live with what he'd done, what he'd been made to do. He thought the guilt would destroy him. Instead, it motivated him to spend his life making sure no other child experiences what he experienced. The guilt didn't destroy him. It transformed him into exactly the kind of person he needed when he was 17 and terrified and alone. Sometimes the most broken people become the best healers. Sometimes the deepest wounds create the strongest advocates. Sometimes the children who are failed by every system become the adults who transform those systems for the better. That's the legacy of Harrison's abuse. Not just trauma and pain, but also purpose and change. Not just broken children, but adults who refuse to let other children be broken in the same way. It's taken 9 years, but I can finally say this. Harrison didn't win. He caused tremendous pain, destroyed innocence, and shattered trust. But he didn't break these kids permanently. They broke his cycle of abuse instead. They turned their victimization into advocacy, their trauma into strength, their pain into purpose. They refused to let his abuse be the defining story of their lives and instead made it the motivation for their life's work. That's what survival looks like. Not the absence of pain, but the transformation of pain into something meaningful. Not the erasure of trauma, but the use of trauma to help others heal. My son's confession shattered my world. But from those shattered pieces, we built something stronger. A life dedicated to protecting other children. A commitment to ensuring that what happened to us never happens to anyone else. A refusal to let evil have the final word. Sometimes the most heartbreaking confessions lead to the most important revelations. Sometimes the worst betrayals create the strongest protectors. Sometimes the deepest darkness produces the brightest light. Harrison may have stolen their childhoods, but he couldn't steal their futures. And those futures, dedicated to protection, healing, and justice, are his ultimate defeat.